SoundCartel.
It's been a huge year for podcasting, with big tech companies entering the industry at rapid pace in 2021. Distribution opportunities for podcasters are growing by the day. But with more options comes more choice. So what does it all mean for podcast producers? Well, for answers and advice, we're talking to Rob Greenlee, VP of Content and Partnerships at Libsyn and AdvertiseCast, who keeps a close eye on the ever-changing podcasting landscape.
I think the opportunities that are in front of us is all of the content creators that are on YouTube today, primarily emphasizing video. Many of them can be audio podcasters too with the same content. But it does take a little bit of a different approach to be able to walk that line appropriately. But you do see this divide between those two content creators. Either they're very successful in audio or they're very successful on video. You don't see a lot that are kind of like successfully doing both.
I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of audio agency SoundCartel, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 19 of season 5. And joining me is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
G'day, Nick.
Now, a lot has happened in podcasting since we last spoke to Rob Greenlee on this podcast, a little more than a year ago.
Wow, what a year it's been. There are so many more podcasts, the audiences are growing, new tech players on the scene, and so many new opportunities for distribution, audience growth, and monetization.
Yeah, that's right. And there are few who keep a keener eye on those developments in the industry than Rob. In fact, he's been doing so since the very start of podcasting. And in 2017 was inducted into the Academy of Podcasters Hall of Fame.
He certainly was. And Rob is currently the VP of Content and Partnerships at Libsyn and AdvertiseCast. He was the founding chairperson and remains a current board member of the Podcast Academy. And Rob also co-hosts the new media show, which makes him a highly sought-after commentator on the podcasting industry. So we're super excited to have him back here with us.
Welcome back, Rob, to Podcasting Essentials.
It's great to be here.
Rob, it's so nice to have you back after all this time. 2021 has been a huge year for the podcasting industry, and we are especially keen to get your views on distribution opportunities for podcasters. But first, last year, when you were on Podcasting Essentials, you'd just been appointed inaugural chair of the Podcast Academy. There's been a leadership shuffle since then, and you're still on the board of governors. But podcasting thriving during the pandemic, did it impact the Academy's goals or approach to the industry, do you think?
I think it did in some ways, but I think the overall goals of the organization were pretty consistent. What we were trying to accomplish, we were trying to build a world-class kind of awards type of process and experience to be able to reach listeners as well as the podcasting industry. So I think the pandemic created some challenges for us. I think it was more of our pursuit of trying to be sensitive to the social changes that were happening as a result of the pandemic, not so much the pandemic itself. So I think what we're starting to see now is the podcasting space is really becoming that same ideology of expanding the access and expanding the listener base to every part of human society.
When are the next awards, Rob?
Coming up in March, on March 22nd in Los Angeles. It's going to be just the day prior to the beginning of the Podcast Movement Conference in Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
On the 23rd of March, 2022. It's coming up.
Hopefully we can all travel by then.
I know.
Yeah.
Now, podcasting's really spread its wings this year. We saw several new large players enter the market. More than just several, it's quite a list. Amazon and Facebook, just to mention a couple. We see it mostly as good news, but I'm interested to know whether you agree with that and what's the impact that they're having.
Yeah, I think that both of those players give podcasters access to huge potential audiences. And that's always the lens that I look at these things through. I think in a general sense, it's all good. And it's a sign of the maturity of the industry that those type of companies are embracing audio in the podcasting medium. If you really think about it, a lot of those companies are already heavily involved in audio at some level or not. I think Facebook is the one that's probably the most surprising to me. They've been very reluctant over many years. And to see this kind of shift happen, I think it's really great. I mean, it gives access to, over 2 billion people on the planet to podcasting.
And speaking of large audiences, India is starting to play a role.
Yeah, as a country, I mean, they are definitely embracing the podcasting medium in a fantastic way from a content creation and a content listening platform. Now, granted, that country has had strong listenership to English content as well as its own native language content for many years. But what we saw happen in 2021 is the two largest music streaming platforms get into podcasting. That's Ghana and JioSaavn. And combined between the two of them gives access to about 300 million new potential listeners. And what we're seeing on the hosting side is many shows that get included in those two catalogs see, a significant bump in their overall listenership numbers. So you start to think about that in combination with all the other big players that are getting into the medium, and there's more to come. There's also Samsung, which also has launched a new listening app across all those many hundreds of millions of Android devices out there, which were always wanting to push podcasting onto Android devices as much as we can. So we've seen Google get into podcasting in a large way, which is they make the Android operating system, and then seeing a Samsung, which is a huge handset maker on the planet Earth, much bigger than Apple, actually in a unit basis, is a big development. And I think it's only going to add more potential listeners to the pie across the planet Earth.
And what about YouTube podcasting,
Yeah.
Rob? We talk a lot about YouTube kind of leading this space, attracting a big audience. Yeah. What are your thoughts on YouTube?
Well, I think what we're seeing is kind of two heads to the Google mix right now. You've got the Google Podcasts that's been around for a while now, and I think they're going through a little bit of a retooling to some degree with their teams. I think we're seeing a yet-to-be kind of launched effort around YouTube podcasts. They recently launched YouTube Music, which is a audio-only platform. So you can clearly see where YouTube is likely going to get into this and offer an audio-only experience around podcasts. But it's also the second largest podcast discovery platform on the video side. But I do think that as we look forward, YouTube is going to have a significant influence on the growth of podcasting. And I think it's also sparking a lot of interest in creating more and more video around podcasting too. Yeah.
With that said, technology is changing, and an example is distribution is extending beyond just RSS feeds, which was the foundation of podcasting distribution, and it's what made it accessible to anybody. But larger tech are starting to flex their muscles. Can you explain some of the changes and how they're starting to affect the industry?
Yeah, I think RSS is still the foundation for podcasting. That download is not going away, but I do think that there's some efforts on the part of some of the larger tech companies, some of the music streaming platforms to do other things with podcast content, right? Put them out there in exclusive distribution relationships. I think a great example is the Joe Rogan podcast that was brought over to Spotify and is only hosted on Spotify. So now Joe still maintains his podcast RSS feed in Libsyn, so he's always ready to make that change if he needs to. But I think that there is some movement around some of the companies wanting to utilize these popular podcasts as a way to grow their subscription user base. But it does kind of put in question whether or not Joe is actually a podcast now. If you really think about it from just like what you're talking about, the history of podcasting being RSS-based. The other thing that's been happening too is premium subscriptions, which are oftentimes not hosted on public RSS feeds either. And more shows are heading that direction as well. So yeah, I do think that there's some movement beyond RSS. But I think at the end of the day, the open RSS is what built podcasting and is what it's based on. And there's going to be people trying different things, but this has been tried before and it usually has a fairly small impact.
We've had some discussions about RSS in the past and what constitutes a podcast.
Right.
How important is RSS to the definition of a podcast, do you think?
I think it's a cultural question at the end of the day. The concept of open distribution, do we value that as a culture, as a society? It's the last bastion, I think, of open distribution other than, say, what we see with YouTube, because it's open to all sorts of kinds of content. But let's be clear, it is a proprietary platform. And RSS is not based on a proprietary platform. It is a little bit of a proprietary technology, but it's also a technology that can be augmented by individuals out there. And whether or not it's supported is more of an organic-based process, not unlike what we're seeing with the Podcast Index and the Podcast 2.0 initiatives by Mr. Adam Curry. He's been pushing on trying to keep the open nature of podcasting going and driving some new tags and some new initiatives to extend RSS, because I think where the pressure comes on trying to move beyond RSS is if there's a lack of new ideas and new innovations and new tags that can create different types of economic or distribution opportunities or metadata opportunities in the current infrastructure of RSS. So.
And I also asked because you mentioned just before that you wondered if Joe has actually now a podcast being on Spotify. For a lot of people, a podcast is on-demand audio that's accessible anytime. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Would you question Joe being on Spotify as not being a podcast?
If I took an origins view, you would say that he's not doing a podcast anymore. He's doing an on-demand audio show. I would say that the definition of what a podcast is now is starting to change, and it's being driven by listeners' perception and listener understanding as the medium grows and develops and reaches basically the majority of the population. Not everybody understands the distinctions, and not everybody even cares what the distinctions are between what a podcast is and what a podcast isn't. And so it's kind of a technical question at the end of the day, and listeners don't really care about that. So that's why I kind of have changed how I talk about the podcasting medium now too, is to be a little bit more inclusive generally of other types of distribution methodologies around getting the content to listeners, because at the end of the day, that's what we all want, is getting the content to listeners. However they want to listen to it is really the most important thing.
I said 5 years ago on season 1 of this podcast that I didn't like the word podcast because it kind of...
Well, you're not alone.
And I think what we're debating now around the definition of podcasting is of little importance to listeners out there.
Yeah.
If they like listening to Joe Rogan on Spotify, they don't care whether it's RSS or not. Yeah. They just want to listen to great audio.
Yeah.
And we've already discussed that the distribution platforms and opportunities are increasing.
Yeah.
And that's great. But the potential negative is for producers now, they have to make decisions about where they make their podcasts available. Mm-hmm. It's not just as simple as throw the RSS feed out there and it'll be everywhere where you get good podcasts. Because if you want to be on YouTube, you've got to go down a whole different process. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that there might be audio-only versions, and that'll be a whole different thing. But right now, a podcast on YouTube includes video. So, for example, do you need to be on YouTube in 2022? And if so, how do you do it? Beyond that, how do you utilize Facebook, which is different again to RSS? Mm-hmm. And for producers that are just looking for, help me, Rob, where do I prioritize distribution now?
Right.
What's your advice?
Well, I think in a general sense, you just have to keep things fundamental. I think RSS is a foundation for syndication of audio. So, I think you still need to have that RSS feed to get your maximum distribution. Now, even Facebook is supporting RSS feeds. So you submit your RSS feed to Facebook into your Pages page. So really the only area that's really in question is a platform like YouTube. And if YouTube supports audio podcasts here soon, then you're going to submit your RSS feed to YouTube too. And video is its own separate kind of animal. You can publish audio up to the video side of YouTube right now. You just have to make that audio a video file, which has like a still image or something like that, and people have been doing that for years. So there's nothing new about that. I think the opportunities that are in front of us is is all of the content creators that are on YouTube today, primarily emphasizing video. Many of them can be audio podcasters too with the same content. But it does take a little bit of a different approach to be able to walk that line appropriately. But you do see this kind of this divide between those two content creators. Either they're very successful in audio or they're very successful on video. You don't see a lot that are kind of like successfully doing both. And there are some examples out there, but they're kind of rare. And that's where a unique opportunity is. And I think people love video and people love audio. And I think sometimes it's different people. So if you can cater to that, if you can figure that one out, which I think it's possible. And I do a show with Todd Cochran called The New Media Show, and we do video. And I would say that probably 20% of our overall audience is video. And I think that's a pretty significant number. We're getting about 17,000 downloads of our show overall across all of our distribution. And if you think about 20% of that coming through a video podcast feed, which is the same thing as an audio feed, it just happens to have a video file linked into it. There's been significant people that have subscribed to that because there are 3 or 4 of the podcast listening platforms that support video right now too, not just audio.
I'm glad you mentioned your new media show, Rob, because I was going to ask you a question about that. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested to know, from a production point of view, do you think video first or audio first?
I think it depends on what the content creator wants to do and how creative they want to be with their video. I think if you want to do video, I think you have to think more about the visual elements. But you also have to not disconnect from your audio audience to do too much visual. So that's the balance. You need to think about your backgrounds. You need to think about your lighting. You need to think about all these things that are important to create a pleasing visual if you're going to watch a podcast on a big screen television or something like that, which you can do with YouTube, right? I mean, I do it all the time. So it's something that I see content creators moving that direction more and more, building like sets for themselves in their basements or in their spare bedrooms or whatever. As long as they describe what's being visualized, they can make that bridge between being an audio show and a video show.
I think doing video, if you're going to do it properly, as you've just explained.
Yeah.
Last question about the new media show. For the audio-only version, do you re-edit that?
No, we don't. So we don't actually edit any part of that show. So, I mean, maybe trim off the ends, but that's generally not cut out of the replay, like off of Facebook or YouTube, because that's already recorded by that platform. So that stuff is in there, but the video version of it, yeah, you can go in and kind of trim that kind of lead-in stuff out of there. So when you watch the on-demand as a video podcast, it's more aligned with what the audio version sounds like. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Rob, Spotify seems pretty cashed up at the moment and ready to do some more shopping. So where do you think they'll focus their interest, and what does it mean for the industry?
Well, I think that they're going to keep acquiring content, would be my speculation. I know here in the last month or so, they pushed a little harder into premium paid subscription type content. I know we did a deal with them to get Libsyn's premium platform as a third-party partner with Spotify. So I think they're going to be pushing on basically all of the angles as they try and gobble up the industry. I think we may see, a few of the other larger companies out there gobble up more players in the industry. We certainly have major tech companies that are flush with cash, so I'm not sure that we've seen the end of that. So Spotify is going to continue to grow. There's a lot of debate in the industry right now of how much penetration Spotify really has in the market. There's just a lot of conflicting data on that, because the industry just in general doesn't have a good roll-up of all the data, so we can actually make accurate projections around who's doing what and how much of a percentage they have and things like that.
Well, I actually have a use case on this exact point.
Yeah.
And I know that I'm just a survey of one.
Yeah.
But I used to listen to Heavyweight religiously before it became a Spotify exclusive as part of Spotify's acquisition of Gimlet in 2019. Heavyweight has always had a huge, loyal following, and today some episodes are available on other apps, but not all series. And it can be a bit confusing. What episode did I listen to on Pocket Casts, and so that I don't listen to the same one by accident on Spotify. And it's just an extra barrier to the listening experience. But I will eventually finish the new series because I do love the show. But it is taking much longer because there are heaps of other shows that have filled that vacuum for me, and I spend a lot more time in Pocket Casts. But I was listening to a new heavyweight episode just recently on Spotify, and what struck me is that since becoming exclusive, there are mid-rolls by the host, Jonathan Goldstein, which are essentially calls to action. They remind people that the full series are only available on Spotify and that he understands that changing habits can be hard, but that Spotify is an easy, intuitive platform to use, etc., etc. Now, these appeals could just be a result of the complete podcast being fenced off to one platform, or their download numbers have taken a hit and they're trying to claw them back. If it's the latter, I think it would be incredibly frustrating to try and reclaim audience and that brand loyalty that you've worked so hard to build. And I wonder, from Jonathan Goldstein's perspective, if he finds that an awkward position to be in, having produced the show since 2016 and having had so much success with it.
The other part that kind of is a companion to that thought is, and this applies to Joe Rogan too, there's been some evidence that him going exclusive has, I would say, reduced his influence in the podcasting space, maybe reduced his audience. I mean, think about it logically. You're widely distributed on all these huge platforms, and he's now moved to one of the platforms, right? The question I keep asking myself about is, how much audience did he give up to do that deal? Yeah. And is there some sort of compromise, too much of a compromise that he had to make to actually fit in with that deal? Could he have made more money by staying independent? My thought is there's a good chance of that. This is another reason why I think that these exclusive deals are going to be like revolving doors of content creators, right? They're going to get a 2-year deal. They're going to spend time there getting cashed out of sorts, and they're going to realize, well, I had to give up 20% of my audience to make this move, or 30% or 40%, who knows? And I'm going to go back to wide open distribution again where I can get 100%. So I can see what your point is that they're pleading for people to come over and keep listening to them, right?
Yeah, look, you're essentially asking people to change their habits, their listening habits, and
right.
That is inherently hard for humans to do. We know that.
Right.
Podcasting is about establishing consistency.
Right.
We tell clients to release their podcast on the same day, the same time each week or fortnight, to maintain the format, to maintain the host. But as more podcasts move from open to exclusive ecosystems, while the money might be great, is that what podcasting is now primarily about? What is the cost-benefit analysis? And is it worth perhaps losing 10, 20, 30% of your audience? Maybe it is. But I think to your point, Rob, it's going to be really important to understand the real penetration figures and the impact on audience. Now, look, I'm not for one side or the other. I just think it's a discussion that's going to become more important over time as the podcasting landscape continues to commercialise and change at such a rapid pace. And are the claims of exclusivity all that they're made out to be?
I agree.
But we must move on because, Rob, I did want to ask you about Libsyn's recent acquisition of AdvertiseCast. Can you tell us a bit about that and what your plans are for the platform?
Yeah, Libsyn here in the last few months has acquired a platform that has been developing over the last few years, catering to podcasts, trying to drive advertising opportunities into those shows. We're currently working with about 1,500 podcasts right now and hoping to grow that list. And we are trying to shift the model we're working with right now, which tend to be shows that have at least 5,000 downloads per episode over a 4-week window. So if we can get it down to like 1,000 or 2,000, then that opens up the door to many more podcasters to get involved in having some ads in their shows to generate some revenue from their efforts. And then that in combination with premium and subscription-based stuff, opportunities are also available. And now, granted, for the smaller shows, it's not going to generate a lot of revenue, but at least it's some revenue that can come in from it to offset costs. I think where the industry is kind of rubbing with that is that does tend to put more pressure on shows to have higher densities of advertising, which flies a little bit against the history and the tradition of the medium of being fairly advertising light. So that's the balance that we have to strike before you start losing audience because you're over commercialized. So we're excited about being able to build that into the platform and work with that team that had established a terrific reputation in the industry, and having a team that really is full-time working on podcast advertising, which is, there's not a lot of companies out there doing that. So it's a great opportunity for Libsyn. Yeah.
Because AdvertiseCast's been around for a few years. Now that they're under the Libsyn banner, does that mean you have to be hosting on Libsyn to use that service?
No, you don't. Actually, that company was built on being fairly ambidextrous of hosting wherever you want to, and that continues today. It's trying to be an add to that relationship than an exclusive opportunity.
Final question, Rob. We're coming to the end of 2021, so it's a great time to dust off the crystal ball. What are the biggest changes we're going to see in podcasting in 2022, and where will the biggest opportunities for brands wanting to step into the medium?
I think the opportunities are getting better. I have this mixed opinion about advertising as a core piece of the podcasting industry going forward. I think it's got its place, but I think that there's another part here, and it's more focused around content marketing. And I see brand podcasts, and I've been involved in that kind of stuff for years myself, doing shows for companies that I've worked for. If it's done right, it's such a powerful thing. Those shows don't have to be commercial, right? They don't have to be something other than just building customer loyalty, customer relationships, brand affinity with their users or their customers or future customers. It's a huge opportunity that is going to continue to grow. But I do think that 2022 and 2023 are going to be big years for advertising. I think the industry is kind of doubling down on it, and a lot of these big tech companies are doubling down on it. And they're trying to cater to what the advertisers want and the agencies that are buying these ads more and more with data and targeting and all sorts of things in expansion. I mean, you just look at the big companies that are involved in podcasting now, and that's one of their primary business models. And as the radio industry gets deeper and deeper involved, that's always been core to what they do. And they have a lot of advertisers that they have relationships with. So they're going to try and shift them over to podcasting. And then I think we're finally going to see ubiquity of distribution across all the major music streaming listening platforms. And I think we'll see some movement towards genre areas, gender-based platforms, race-based platforms that are catering to specific audiences that have a particular interest. I think that's kind of like the next phase that we're going to come into once we're, on all these big tech platforms. So
a lot to look forward to, and good luck with your new media show. We'll keep listening in or watching on.
Thank you.
As you keep abreast of all these developments, and hopefully we can chat again next year on Podcasting Essentials.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Thank you, Rob. It's been fantastic. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. It's always fun talking to you guys.
It really has been an incredible year when you think about all that has happened since Rob was last on the show.
I know, it's like another world. But it's not really until you start listing the new industry entrants like Facebook, Amazon, Samsung, and add to that paid podcast subscriptions. The opportunities have come thick and fast, and it really doesn't look like it'll be slowing down in 2022, Nick.
No, I think there will be plenty for us to talk about next year as well, Nicole.
Oh, yeah.
But before we finish up this episode, I just want to touch on one topic, the video versus audio podcast discussion again, because it's been a recurring theme of 2021 here on this podcast, and I think it's going to be one that's going to be equally important as we move into 2022.
It does put paid to the rise in popularity of YouTube that we've been talking about for so long in the podcasting space.
It's one that surprised me a little bit, but it does make sense and the stats are there, so we can't keep ignoring it. And if YouTube do go ahead with an audio-only part of their platform, well, that's going to be a game changer too, because a platform of that size, you really can't ignore it as far as distribution of your podcast. I guess I want to focus just a little bit on that. Should you do video? And if you are going to do video, we were talking to Rob about his new media show, which is filmed as a live video stream.
Yeah.
And then he also publishes it as an audio podcast through many other platforms, like you should. But the reason I asked the question, do they do any editing of the video for audio, was because I sort of think that you should create your podcast for an audio first or a video first audience with that mindset when you go into the production. He quite correctly has set up the video stream with the right lighting and the cameras and all that. And so it looks good. It makes sense. Similarly, I don't think it's a good idea to take a audio-first podcast and put it up onto YouTube just because you can with static images, and that's not really a video. I think you've got to respect your audience, and if that means taking the video version and then doing a re-edit for audio. For example, if it's a stage show that you then want to publish as a podcast. We did that for Melbourne Wine and Food a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
It's fantastic for people that couldn't be there live in the room to be able to listen to the podcast version. But there are some things that happen live in the room that just don't quite work in a podcast. So spending a little bit of time tweaking it, doing a bit of an edit, adding a top and tail, a studio recorded introduction, just gives the listeners of the audio-only version at least that feeling that you thought about them.
Yeah, and look, there are plenty of highly successful podcasts that are very much video first, audio second. But I think as YouTube really starts to claim the ground that we think it's going to or that they want to, I think we need to have the audience in mind if indeed audio and video is going to be the goal for new podcasters coming in and existing podcast producers.
Yeah, it makes it tough because you've got to do both really well in an ideal world, and that does take time and resources. So it's tricky.
It is tricky, and as if there weren't enough demands on podcast producers, Nick, now video seems to be the next one on the list.
But to finish on a positive, it is great that there are so many platforms coming into the market. There is huge opportunity for distribution channels. Facebook with their huge audience. Add to that Samsung. We're talking about hundreds of millions, billions of people on these platforms, a lot of which probably aren't podcast listeners right now. So the opportunity there is just massive.
It is, and the effort will be worth it.
Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. And it brings us to the end of Season 5. But we will be back with Season 6 in 2022. And in the meantime, you can catch up on the highlights of a huge year in our summer series of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for co-hosting with me again this season and for all your insights and discussion. We could probably talk podcasting all day, but we best get back to work.
Yeah, it's been a joy, Nick. And I have to say, our guest lineup this year has been outstanding.
Yeah, a huge thank you to them all for taking the time to be on the show.
For sure. And look, we've learnt so much. And so I know our Podcasting Essentials audience have found this season to be incredibly valuable once again, be they brands, industry professionals, or just passionate podcasters alike. And of course, thank you, Nick, for being a super co-host as usual. And yes, back to work.
Well, actually, speaking of work, we don't mention our clients very often, but I would like to just mention a music podcast that we've released recently that you've worked really hard on, Nicole, and it's being very well received.
Yeah, Sound Minds is a podcast that we produced for and with Reason Studios. It takes a peek into the music careers of some extremely talented singers, songwriters and producers. So we've been getting some amazing audience feedback, and it's just been featured by Apple Podcasts.
Yeah, great recognition for a podcast that's been well produced, but also that Reason Studios have done an amazing job of marketing and using their resources and reach to get the podcast out there.
Yeah, we've gone on about this a lot, Nick. The fact that marketing is 50, 60 or more % of any podcast production, and Reason Studios are an incredible example of stepping up to the plate, putting in the work, the time, throwing resources at it, and the impact is just rolling along and it's doing incredible things.
So check out Sound Minds, and another SoundCartel podcast to check out for business tips and inspiration is our own Business Essentials Daily, your wake-up call to success.
Yes, it's definitely one not to miss, Nick. Every morning.
Well, you have to say that. You're the host.
I do have to say.
Well, that really is a wrap for this season. For more about us and how we can help you produce a podcast, visit soundcartel.com.au or our socials at SoundCartelAU. From the team at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.
SoundCartel.